In a remote Appalachian valley, a cartographer named Daniel Rains was about to uncover something should have remained buried. A routine mapping expedition turned into a nightmare when he stumbled upon an unmarked grave, its ancient chains rusted, but unbroken. Daniel Rains wasn't another surveyor. For 12 years, he was a military scout, navigating hostile terrain with precision and uncovering hidden threats before they struck. His reputation for reading the land was unmatched, until the land started reading him. When Daniel disturbed the grave, he had no idea he was breaking a seal had held something at bay for centuries. The valley wasn't uncharted, it was unclaimed, resisting its place in the world. And now something was awake, watching. What began as a simple expedition would become a descent into a shifting, living nightmare. The valley would never be the same after Daniel's discovery, and neither would he. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Rains watched the mist curl through the pines as he pulled his weathered Jeep into Harlan's Creek, a town barely clinging to the map of Appalachia. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes back, forcing him to rely on paper maps. Fitting, he thought, for a cartographer tasked with filling in the blanks of the world. The development company's instructions had been clear. Survey the unmarked valley locals called the Hollow, document its topography, and mark potential access points for the planned resort. They mentioned nothing about the way conversation died when he entered the gas station, or how the attendant's eyes widened at the mention of his destination. You're going where? The elderly man's hand trembled slightly as he counted Daniel's change. The valley past Miller's Ridge, Daniel replied, watching the man carefully. Supposed to be pristine land, untouched. There's reasons places stay. Untouched, son. Daniel had heard it all before. Every small town had its legends, its superstitions. As a former military scout turned cartographer, he'd learned to filter local folklore from actionable intelligence. Still, something in the old man's voice made him pause. Appreciate the concern, Daniel said, pocketing his change. But I've got a job to do. The man nodded, his eyes distant. Don't we all? Ellie's Diner sat at the town's edge, its neon open sign buzzing intermittently like a warning. Daniel needed coffee, and more importantly, local knowledge before heading into the valley. The bell chimed as he entered, and again conversation faltered. A woman behind the counter, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, keen eyes, watched him with an intensity felt almost professional. Coffee, black, Daniel said, sliding onto a stool. And directions, if you've got them. Depends where you're heading. Her voice carried no warmth but no hostility either. Caution. The valley past Miller's Ridge. I'm mapping it for... No, you're not. She placed the coffee before him with deliberate slowness. Nobody maps valley. Daniel raised an eyebrow. And you are? Eleanor Graves, Ellie. This is my place. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. And valley isn't on any map for a reason. Something in her tone, not fear but certainty, made the hairs on Daniel's neck rise. He'd developed a sixth sense during his time overseas, an instinct for when someone knew something worth hearing. I'm listening. Ellie glanced around the diner. Not here, meet me out back in 5. Behind the diner, Ellie stood smoking, her gaze fixed on the distant ridge where mist to pool unnaturally. She didn't look at Daniel as he approached. My grandmother was the last keeper of the valley's stories. She began without preamble. She disappeared up there when I was 15. They found her jacket, nothing else. Ellie exhaled smoke mingled with the mountain air. She's not the first. People who go in don't always come out. Could be anything, Daniel replied. Rough terrain, wildlife. It's not bears or bad footing taking people, Mr. Rains. Daniel stiffened. I didn't give you my name. A humorless smile crossed Ellie's face. Small town, word travels. She dropped her cigarette, crushing it beneath her boot. The valley doesn't like to be seen, doesn't like to be known. There's something in there, something the old settlers tried to keep buried. My grandmother called it the sealed one. Ms. Graves, call it superstition if you want. Ellie's eyes met his, challenging. But whatever's in valley, It calls to people, makes them dig where they shouldn't, and once they do..." She shook her head. "You remind me of my grandmother. Same look in your eyes, like you're searching for something beyond the horizon. Be careful is not exactly what finds you." Before Daniel could respond, a police cruiser pulled into the lot. A heavy-set man in a sheriff's uniform approached, his gait unhurried but purposeful. "This the surveyor?" he asked Ellie, who nodded curtly before heading back inside. "Sheriff Tom Wallace." The man extended a weathered hand. "Heard you're heading up to map the valley." Daniel shook it. "That's right. Problem?" Wallace's face remained carefully neutral. "Advice. Area's got tricky terrain, sudden weather changes, no cell service." He adjusted his belt with practiced nonchalance. "And a history of hikers getting turned around. My father went missing up there years back, never found a trace." "I'm sorry to hear." "Yeah, well..." Wallace's jaw tightened. "Watch yourself, and stick to your maps. Folks around here get creative with their explanations when things don't make sense." "Like Ellie's sealed one?" Daniel ventured. Something flickered across Wallace's face. Not fear, but a momentary hesitation. Ghost stories, nothing more. He turned to leave, then paused. "But if you find anything up there, unusual, you radio it in. I put the frequency in your permit paperwork." "Unusual like what?" The sheriff's gaze drifted toward the mist-shrouded mountains. "You'll know it if you see it." The hike into the valley took longer than Daniel anticipated. What had appeared to be straightforward terrain on satellite imagery proved deceptively complex on the ground. The path twisted, doubled back on itself as if reluctant to lead him deeper. By mid-afternoon, he knew something was wrong. Not dangerous necessarily, but off. The forest had gone silent. No bird song, no scurrying undergrowth, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. A pervasive waiting stillness. Daniel had felt something similar once before in a mountain pass in Afghanistan. The unnatural quiet before an ambush. His military instincts flared, but he pressed on. At a small clearing, he found the first sign others had ventured this way. An abandoned geologist's hammer, its wooden handle rotted but its metal head intact, the brand name still visible beneath a patina of rust. Nearby lay a broken compass, its needle spinning erratically. Could be magnetic anomalies in the rock, Daniel thought. He made a notation on his digital tablet. Maintaining the precise cataloging had become second nature. Longitude, latitude, elevation, anomalies. The data was his anchor in unusual circumstances. But as he descended deeper into the valley, even his instruments behave erratically. The GPS tracker, already struggling, now showed impossible readings, as if the valley floor were simultaneously rising and falling. His tablet glitched, digital maps warping before stabilizing. Late afternoon found him at the valley's lowest point, where the mist hung most heavily. Here the trees grew twisted, their trunks contorted as if straining away from the ground beneath them. And there, half hidden among rocks and undergrowth, Daniel spotted what looked like a crude gravesite. A circle of stones, arranged deliberately, covered what appeared to be a shallow depression in the earth. Around it lay decayed objects, a rotted leather pouch, glass beads strung on disintegrating cord, a knife with a bone handle. Offerings or warnings. Daniel's instincts screamed to leave it undisturbed, to mark it on his map and move on. But another part of him, the part had joined the military to see what lay beyond known borders. The part had become a cartographer, to fill in the world's blank spaces, pulled him forward. "This is why you're here," a voice inside him whispered. "To uncover what's hidden, to find what others have lost." The image of Matthew flickered unbidden in his mind. His brothers, smile on their last morning together before he'd ventured alone into wilderness not unlike this. Daniel had stayed behind day, had let his brother go alone. The search parties never found a trace. Daniel's hands moved almost of their own accord. clearing away smaller stones, revealing ancient, weathered chains beneath. Metal should have, corroded centuries ago, gleamed with unnatural preservation. Symbols he didn't recognize had been etched into each link, their patterns precise and deliberate, evidence of previous settlement, he murmured to himself, recording notes with forced clinical detachment. Possible burial site with ritual significance. When he shifted the final stone, the air around him changed, grew dense, charged with something beyond humidity. The depression wasn't shallow as he'd thought. It opened to a deeper chamber, and there, partially preserved in the airless space, lay something had once been human. The body, if it could be called, was wrapped in more chains, binding arms to torso, legs together. But it was the face made Daniel's breath catch. The mouth had been sewn shut with what looked like copper wire, the stitches pulling the lips into a grotesque grimace. The eyes were sunken hollows, yet Daniel couldn't shake the impression they were watching him. He stumbled backward, scientific curiosity warring with primal revulsion. As he did, his boot caught on one of the chains, pulling it free from where it had been secured. A sound rolled through the valley, not thunder, not a groan. It to come, from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet, through his chest cavity, through his skull. Daniel froze, every combat-honed instinct on high alert. But the sound didn't repeat. Nothing moved. The oppressive silence returned, somehow deeper than before. Shaken, he carefully replaced the stones, trying to restore the grave to its original state. But as he worked, he couldn't escape the feeling the damage was already done. Something fundamental had shifted in the valley around him. The light was fading. Setting up camp now was his only option. Navigating the twisting paths in darkness would be suicidal. With practiced efficiency, he established a perimeter 30 yards from the gravesite, erected his tent, and built a small fire. The flames burned oddly, offering warmth against the unnatural chill had settled since his discovery. As Daniel laid out his sleeping bag, a gleam caught his eye. One of the chains from the grave, somehow tangled in his equipment. He must have accidentally brought it with him. He'd return it tomorrow, he decided, placing it carefully beside his pack. Night fell completely. Not the gradual twilight of normal wilderness, but a sudden descent, as if someone had drawn a black curtain across the valley. Daniel stared into the fire, its light seeming to extend only inches before being swallowed by the absolute darkness beyond. In darkness, something watched and waited. Daniel stared at his radio, considering calling Sheriff Wallace, reporting what he'd found. But what would he say? "I found an old body, scared me. I heard a strange noise." Nothing concrete had happened. Nothing he couldn't explain with rational science, decomposition gases, acoustics of the valley amplifying distant thunder. He settled into his sleeping bag, eyes trained on the darkness beyond his fire. Another mapping job, he whispered to himself. But as his fire dimmed to embers, casting grotesque shadows across his tent, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling the valley was no longer empty. In disturbing grave, he'd awakened something had been waiting a long time. And somewhere in the darkness, something drew closer, moving with terrible purpose toward the warmth of his camp. Daniel jerked awake, his military instincts instantly alert. The fire had died to nothing, impossible given the amount of wood he'd stacked. His watch read 3:17 a.m., the luminescent dial one of the only sources of light in the oppressive darkness. The temperature inside his tent had plummeted, his breath condensing in pale clouds before his face. But it was the sound had awakened him. Whispers, beyond the thin fabric walls. Not the rustle of leaves or the natural murmurs of a forest at night, but articulated voices speaking with rhythmic urgency. Words he couldn't catch, repeated in a cadence felt almost like chanting. Wind through rock formations, he told himself. Sound carries strangely in valleys like this. The explanation felt hollow even as he formed it. Daniel reached for his flashlight, his fingers brushing against the chain he'd accidentally brought from the grave. It lay coiled beside his pack, but now, impossibly, It felt warm to the touch, almost vibrating with energy. He yanked his hand back. The whispering intensified, no longer distant, but directly outside his tent, circling. Multiple voices now, overlapping, their words still, unintelligible but their tone unmistakably urgent, warning, threatening, beckoning. He couldn't tell. Daniel reached for his sidearm, habit from years in hostile territory. The familiar weight of it steadied his mind, though using it against disembodied voices absurd. "Who's there?" he called. His voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his system. The whispers stopped immediately. The silence followed was somehow worse, expectant, like the held breath before violence. Daniel unzipped his tent with deliberate slowness, sweeping his flashlight in a practiced arc as he emerged. The beam cut through darkness so complete it to swallow the light yards from its source. His campsite appeared undisturbed at first glance. The embers in his fire pit had died unnaturally, not even a faint glow remaining. His equipment lay where he'd left it, but as he directed his light toward the perimeter, he froze. Footprints surrounded his tent, dozens of them circling in a precise pattern. They hadn't been there when he'd made his final perimeter check before sleeping. The prints were barefoot, with elongated toes to dig unnaturally deep into the soil. Were small, like a child's. Others were impossibly large. All of them had appeared silently while he slept mere feet away. Daniel's throat constricted. He'd tracked insurgents through mountains, read signs invisible to untrained eyes. He knew what footprints meant. Someone had been watching him. Not from a distance, but from inches away, separated only by the thin fabric of his tent. The chain from the gravesite caught his flashlight beam, reflecting it with unnatural brightness. It had moved, no longer beside his pack but stretched out in a straight line, pointing directly toward the burial site he'd disturbed. "Go back," his instincts screamed. "Leave this place now." But Daniel knew these mountains after dark. Attempting to navigate the treacherous terrain at night would be suicide. He was trapped until dawn, whether he liked it or not. A sound drew his attention, faint, rhythmic. Breathing. Not his own. Slowly, Daniel swept his flashlight across the clearing. Nothing moved in its beam. The breathing continued, at the edge of perception. With it came a smell, earth and decay, but also something metallic like old pennies or blood. His training took over. Daniel methodically checked his surroundings, moving in precise patterns, keeping his back protected. The breathing sound to come from everywhere and nowhere, impossible to pinpoint. When his light passed over the chain again, he noticed it had moved once more, now pointing toward the path led back to the grave. An invitation, or a warning. "Screw this," Daniel muttered, making a decision. Dawn was still hours away, but staying put felt increasingly dangerous. He quickly packed essential gear, leaving the tent and heavier equipment for retrieval later. If something was out there, he'd be moving, then waiting like a trapped animal. The chain from the grave lay directly in his path as he prepared to leave. Daniel hesitated, then picked it up, wrapping it carefully in a bandana before stowing it in his pack. Evidence, he told himself. Something to show Sheriff Wallace or Ellie when he returned. The valley to react to his decision. The whispers returned, more insistent, accompanied by a subtle shift in air pressure made his ears pop. Panic threatened at the edges of his consciousness, but Daniel forced it down, focusing on the practical. Map, compass, light source, weapon, one foot in front of the other. He set off along the path led back to the gravesite, determined to understand what he'd disturbed. The trail longer in darkness, twisting in ways he didn't remember from his daytime journey. Several times he could have sworn he passed the same distinctive tree or rock formation, as if walking in circles despite maintaining a straight course. The footprints followed alongside him, appearing in his flashlight beam several yards ahead, then vanishing when he reached them. Always leading, always beyond. When he finally reached the gravesite, Daniel knew immediately something was wrong. The stones he'd carefully replaced were scattered as if thrown aside by great force. The depression in the earth gaped open, a wound in the forest floor. Daniel approached cautiously, playing his flashlight beam across the disturbed site. The chains had bound, the corpse lay broken, links shattered as if subjected to impossible pressure, and the corpse itself. Daniel's light found it propped against a nearby tree. The body shouldn't have been preserved enough to move, let alone sit upright, yet there it was. Desiccated arms hanging limply at its sides, legs sprawled before it, but it was the face made Daniel's blood run cold. The copper wires had sewn the mouth shut were gone. The lips, drawn back in a grimace, now revealed blackened gums and teeth filed to points. And as he watched, a sound emerged from the gaping mouth. A low, rattling inhale as if the thing were drawing breath for the first time in centuries. Daniel stumbled backward, his boot catching on a root. He fell hard, the impact knocking his flashlight from his grip. It rolled, the beam sweeping wildly across the clearing before settling, illuminating nothing. The corpse was gone. Scrambling to his feet, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and spun in a frantic circle, searching the darkness. Nothing. No corpse, no movement. The violated grave and the eerie silence of the valley. Then he heard it. The same breathing sound, now behind him close. Daniel ran. He crashed through underbrush, abandoned the path entirely, driven by blind panic. The rational part of his brain, the trained soldier, the methodical cartographer, screamed at him to stop, to orient himself, to think. But primal fear had taken control, propelling him deeper into the valley's darkness. When he finally stopped, lungs burning and legs trembling, Daniel realized with dawning horror he was completely lost. The valley stretched around him, unfamiliar in the darkness. Even the stars above wrong somehow, their patterns shifted from what he knew they should be. His compass spun uselessly, the needle rotating in continuous circles. The GPS tracker on his phone remained dead, no signal penetrating whatever shrouded this place. Dawn couldn't be far off. Daniel decided to wait for first light, then use the sun to orient himself. He found a defensible position, his back to Bio, a large boulder, sightlines clear in all directions, and settled in to wait, his sidearm ready. But as the hours passed, he doubted his perception of time. His watch insisted only minutes had gone by, yet the ache in his muscles suggested much longer. The darkness showed no sign of lifting. Occasionally, he would spot movement at the corner of his vision, a flicker of something pale, a suggestion of motion among the trees. Each time he turned to look directly, nothing was there. Yet the sense of being watched intensified, a pressure against his skin like static electricity. The chain in his pack to grow heavier with each passing hour, as if gaining mass. Twice, Daniel considered discarding it, and twice something stopped him. A certainty the chain was important. It connected him to whatever was happening in this valley. When light finally seeped through the canopy above, Daniel almost wept with relief. But the dawn revealed a landscape he didn't recognize. The terrain had shifted subtly overnight. Hills where there should have been flat ground, unfamiliar rock, formations jutting from the earth like broken teeth. The valley had changed, or it had revealed its true nature. Daniel consulted his maps, comparing them to the landscape around him. Nothing matched. It was as if he'd stepped into an entirely different valley than the one he'd surveyed yesterday. "This isn't possible," he muttered, tracing routes with his finger. According to his calculations, he should be able to reach the valley's edge by hiking northwest for approximately 3 hours. He'd follow the rising terrain, eventually connecting with the established trail had led him in. But after 2 hours of steady climbing, Daniel found himself descending again, the land sloping back toward the valley floor. Landmarks he used to track his progress disappeared when he looked back, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. Entire copses of trees appeared where minutes before had been meadow. "I'm losing my mind," he thought, panic bubbling beneath the surface of his forced calm. "Or I'm trapped in kind of hallucination." He remembered Ellie's warning. The valley doesn't like to be seen, doesn't like to be known. By midday, Daniel had abandoned his attempt to find the original trail. Instead, he focused on climbing, following the most consistently upward path he could find. Sooner or later, he reasoned, he would reach the ridgeline. From there, he could orient himself. But the valley, to resist his efforts, paths led upward suddenly twisted back on themselves. Rock faces appeared where his maps showed gentle slopes, and always at the edge of his awareness came sounds, footsteps paralleling his own. Whispers ceased when he stopped to listen, the crack of branches from unseen movement. Late afternoon found him stumbling through a section of forest he hadn't documented, older growth, the trees enormous and gnarled with age. His water was running low and exhaustion clouded his thinking. When he spotted the structure ahead, Daniel initially assumed it was another hallucination. A cabin stood in a small clearing, its timber walls gray with age, its roof partially collapsed. No path led to it. The forest opened around it, as if reluctant to touch its walls. It wasn't on any of his maps. Nothing in the survey data or satellite imagery had shown a structure in this valley. Yet there it stood, solid, real, and unmistakably old. Daniel approached cautiously, years of military training keeping him alert despite his exhaustion. The cabin's door hung partially open on rusted hinges, revealing darkness within. No windows remained intact, gaping openings like blind eyes. "Hello?" he called, knowing as he did the question was absurd. No one had lived here for decades, centuries. No answer came, but as he stepped closer to the threshold, the whispering started again, urgent, insistent, from directly inside the cabin. Daniel's hand moved to his sidearm, drawing it with practiced ease. With his other hand, he flicked on his flashlight and directed its beam into the cabin's interior. The light revealed a single room, its floorboards rotted, its walls covered. In faded markings might have been writing. A rusted iron stove stood in one corner, a rough-hewn table in another. Papers were scattered across the table's surface, yellowed with age but somehow preserved in the dry air of the cabin. No sign of any recent presence. No source for the whispers had now stopped. Daniel stepped inside, the floorboards creaking, ominously beneath his weight. The air felt different here. Stale, yes, but also charged with same strange energy he'd felt at the gravesite, as if something had thinned the boundary between this place and somewhere else. He moved carefully to the table, playing his flashlight over the papers. Maps, he realized with a jolt of recognition. Maps of the valley, hand-drawn with meticulous detail. And beside them, a journal bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. Daniel picked it up, the spine cracking as he opened it. The first page bore a single line. "They won't let me leave. May God have mercy on whoever finds this." The date below it read, June 17th, 1879. Behind him, outside the cabin, something moved. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, approaching the open door. Daniel whirled, weapon raised, light searching the darkness, beyond the threshold. Nothing was there. But the footsteps continued, circling the cabin now, accompanied by a sound like chains dragging across the ground. With shaking hands, Daniel turned back to the journal, knowing with sudden certainty whatever had been buried in grave had followed him here. And as the footsteps completed their circuit of the cabin and paused outside the door, he knew he was no longer the hunter but the hunted. The entity had found him, and night was falling once again. The footsteps outside the cabin halted. Daniel held his breath, weapon trained on the doorway. Flashlight beam illuminating dust particles swirled. In the stale air, seconds stretched into minutes as he waited, every sense heightened to painful acuity. When nothing entered, he made a tactical decision. Information is survival. The journal in his hand might contain answers, something to explain what was happening, even how to escape it. He needed to read it, but not here. Not exposed in the cabin's single room with too many entry points. Daniel glanced up at the ceiling. A trapdoor was visible in one corner, likely leading to a small attic space. Perfect, defensible, with only one approach. Moving silently, he gathered the maps and journal, then eased a rickety chair beneath, the trapdoor. The wood groaned as he climbed onto it but held his weight. The trapdoor opened with surprising ease as if recently used. Daniel pulled himself up into the dark space above, then carefully closed the door behind him. The attic was cramped, the roof so low he had to crouch. But it offered concealment, and through gaps in the weathered shingles he could observe the cabin below and the clearing outside. Settling against a roof beam, Daniel opened the journal, playing his flashlight across its yellowed pages. The first entries documented a survey expedition similar to his own. The author, Thomas Holloway, had been commissioned to map the valley for a mining company in 1879. His initial notes were methodical: soil compositions, terrain assessments, potential mineral deposits. Then the tone changed. June 21st, 1879. Something watches from the trees. Jenkins says I'm imagining things, but Cooper feels it too. The maps don't match what we're seeing. It's as if the valley shifts when we aren't looking. Cooper calls it impossible. Jenkins laughs it off, but I know what I've seen. June 23rd, 1879. Cooper is missing. We found his equipment scattered near the eastern ravine, but no sign of struggle. Jenkins insists he must have fallen. I heard whispering last night, voices calling Cooper's name. When I told Jenkins, he looked at me strangely, said we need to leave this place. June 24th, 1879. Jenkins is dead. I found him at the edge of camp, throat torn open. No animal did this. His eyes, they were sewn shut with what looks like copper wire. I'm alone now. God help me. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he turned the page. The next several entries detailed Holloway's attempts to escape the valley, each ending in failure as paths circled back on themselves or landmarks disappeared. His writing grew increasingly frantic, the neat penmanship deteriorating with each page. July 3rd, 1879. I found the grave today. Ancient, with metal chains embedded in the stones. The natives who guided us initially refused to come into this valley. They spoke of the sealed one, a malevolence bound to this place by their ancestors. I dismissed it as superstition. I was wrong. July 5th, 1879. The voice isn't a voice speaks to me now, offering knowledge, offering escape. It wants something. I don't yet know what. The whispering grows louder at night. I've built this cabin as a shelter, but it offers protection. I've inscribed warding symbols the natives showed me before they left. They seem to help, though I don't know why. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Daniel glanced at the walls below. The faded markings he'd noticed earlier must be Holloway's warding symbols, intricate patterns of interlocking lines and spirals. From his vantage point, he could see they formed a complete circuit around the cabin's interior. He returned to the journal, skipping ahead as the entries grew more disjointed, often tracing the same events with slight variations, as if Holloway's memory was failing. Then he found an entry made his blood freeze. Date unknown. I understand. Now? The valley doesn't distort paths. It rewrites memory, perception, reality itself. The sealed one was a man once, a shaman who sought to step between worlds. His tribe bound him when his ambition turned to madness. But death refused him. Now he exists between, not alive, not dead, feeding on the memories and lives of those who enter his domain. He cannot leave his burial place unless invited out, unless someone disturbs the chains and speaks to the whispers. They're coming for me now. I hear them outside. Don't look at their faces. Don't speak to the voices. The valley rewrites you until nothing remains but what it wants to keep. The final entry was a crude map, hastily sketched. It showed the valley with an X marking what Daniel assumed was the cabin's location. A dotted line led from it to a circular formation labeled the doorway near the valley's center. A single line of text accompanied it. The way out is through. God forgive me for what I've done. The journal ended there. Daniel closed it carefully, his military mind processing the information with forced detachment. The rational part of him still sought logical explanations: mass hallucination, toxic spores affecting cognition, even elaborate hoax. But those explanations felt increasingly hollow against the evidence of his own experiences. Something moved on the cabin floor, below. Daniel froze, extinguishing his flashlight. Through the gaps in the floorboards, he could see a shadow sliding across the moonlight filtered through the cabin's doorway. Elongated, too tall for a human, its proportions wrong in ways defied description. It paused in the center of the room, a darkness deeper than the shadows around it. Daniel could make out no distinct features, an impression of height and wrongness. It to be searching, its movements exhibiting a terrible intelligence. Daniel's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, but he stopped himself. Holloway's warning echoed in his mind. Don't look at their faces. Don't speak to the voices. Drawing attention now might be fatal. The figure below tilted what must have been its head, as if listening. Then, with deliberate slowness, it turned toward the trapdoor. Daniel pressed himself against the roof beams, hardly daring to breathe. The thing below extended what might have been an arm, impossibly long, with too many joints, reaching toward the trapdoor. A sound from outside. The cabin distracted it, something moving in the underbrush. The entity paused, then withdrew its misshapen limb and glided toward the doorway. It hesitated at the threshold, then stepped outside, its form seeming to dissipate into the mist. Daniel remained motionless for long minutes, ensuring it was truly gone. His heart hammered against his ribs, the sound deafening in the silence. When he finally dared to move, he checked Holloway's map against his own, trying to identify the location marked as the doorway. If the cabin's position on the crude map was accurate, the circular formation lay 5 miles deeper into the valley, in the opposite direction from where he'd been trying to escape. Every instinct told him to climb down, to run while the entity was distracted. But the valley had already proven it wouldn't let him leave way. The way out is through. The military strategist in him assessed options. Remaining in the cabin might offer temporary safety, but the entity knew he was here. It would return. Attempting to backtrack to the valley's edge had failed repeatedly. Holloway's map offered the only new option, tenuous as it was. Daniel slipped the journal and maps into his pack, alongside the chain he'd taken from the grave. As he did, his fingers brushed against something in the darkness, fabric not part of his equipment. Directing his flashlight at it, he found a backpack, modern in design, empty except for a weathered student ID card. The photo showed a young man, college-aged. The name read, Matthew Rains. Daniel stared at the ID, recognition and denial warring within him. It couldn't be. His brother had disappeared in mountains hundreds of miles from here. There was no way his backpack could be in this attic, in this valley, unless the valley truly could rewrite reality. Unless it had somehow pulled Matthew here as it had drawn Daniel. With shaking hands, he stowed the ID in his pocket. Questions swirled in his mind, but this wasn't the time or place to confront them. First, he needed to survive, to escape. Then he could unravel the impossible connection between his brother's disappearance and this cursed place. The trapdoor creaked slightly as Daniel eased it open. The cabin below remained empty, moonlight spilling through the doorway and casting long shadows across the floor. He dropped down silently, landing in a crouch, senses alert for any sign of the entity's return. Nothing moved. The warding symbols, on the walls to pulse faintly in the darkness, their patterns drawing his eye in ways made his vision swim. Daniel forced himself to look away, remembering Holloway's warning about the valley's influence on perception. He checked his equipment, ensuring everything was secured for silent movement. As he prepared to leave, his gaze fell on the cabin's table, where he'd found Holloway's journal. Something else lay there now, a small object gleaming in the moonlight. An old compass, its case engraved with initials. M.R. Matthew Rains. Daniel hadn't noticed it before, hadn't moved it, yet here it was. His brother's compass, the one Daniel had given him for his 18th birthday. The compass Matthew had been carrying when he disappeared 5 years ago. The valley is showing me something, Daniel thought. Trying to tell me something, or lure me deeper. Either way, his course was clear. If Matthew had been here, if there was any chance he might still be, Daniel had to follow. The compass joined the ID card in his pocket. Then, consulting Holloway's map one last time, he oriented himself toward the doorway and stepped outside. The night had deepened. The moon, obscured by clouds, hung unnaturally low over the valley. Mist coiled between the trees, forming shapes almost deliberate before dissipating. Daniel moved cautiously, using every skill he'd learned as a military scout to remain undetected. For nearly an hour, he made steady progress, following Holloway's crude map as best he could. The terrain grew increasingly strange. Rock formations twisted into impossible geometries, trees growing horizontally before curving upward toward the hidden sky. The laws of nature more suggestion than rule here. A twig snapped behind him. Daniel froze, listening. Heavy footsteps approached, the same deliberate tread he'd heard outside the cabin. Moving with practiced stealth, he concealed himself behind a massive fallen tree, his body pressed against moss-covered bark. Through a gap in the rotting wood, he watched as a figure emerged from the mist. It moved upright, roughly humanoid, in silhouette but wrong in every detail. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in impossible directions. Its head, if it could be called, shifted constantly, features flowing like wax, never settling on a single form. As it passed his hiding place, Daniel caught a glimpse of what might have been its face. For an instant, it solidified into something recognizable. The desiccated features of the corpse from the grave, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes hollow yet somehow aware. Then it shifted again, and Daniel saw another face emerging from the melting features, younger, painfully familiar. Matthew's face. Daniel bit back a gasp, fingers digging into the rotting wood of his shelter. It couldn't be. Yet there it was. His brother's features, twisted in an expression of agony or ecstasy, before melting back into the amorphous flow. The entity paused, as if sensing his recognition. It turned slowly toward Daniel's hiding place, its form growing more solid with each passing second. Features settled into a grotesque approximation of Matthew's face, the same yet horribly wrong, like a mask worn by something didn't understand how human features should fit together. It opened its mouth. No sound emerged, but Daniel felt, then heard a single word reverberating through his mind. Brother. The chain in his pack grew suddenly hot, burning against his back. Daniel winced, fighting the urge to cry out. The entity took a step toward him, its movements more fluid now, more confident. Another silent word pressed against Daniel's consciousness. Found. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but training held him motionless. Movement now would only confirm his location. Instead, he forced his breathing to remain steady. His muscles relaxed, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The entity took another step, extending a hand elongated impossibly as it reached toward his hiding place. Fingers like twigs, too many joints, skin stretched tight over bone. It was inches from discovering him. Then distantly came the sound of breaking branches. The entity's head snapped toward the noise, its features melting once more into formlessness. It withdrew its grotesque hand and moved away, gliding into the mist with unnatural speed. Daniel remained hidden, counting his heartbeats, ensuring the entity was truly gone before he dared move. When he finally emerged, his legs trembled with repressed tension. The encounter had shaken him more deeply than any combat situation he'd faced overseas. Thing, whatever it was, had known him, had worn his brother's face like a mask, and somehow, impossibly, it had called him brother. Daniel checked Holloway's map again, forcing his mind back to the practical problem of navigation. The doorway couldn't be far now. According to the crude drawings, It lay beyond a series of stepped rock formations, might be the same ones visible through the trees ahead. As he approached the rocks, the mist thickened, coiling around his ankles like something alive. The chain in his pack had cooled, but now it to pulse with a subtle rhythm, like a heartbeat. Daniel realized with growing unease it was pulling him forward, drawing him toward something ahead. The way out is through, he reminded himself, pressing onward despite the dread building inside him. Whatever Holloway had found at the doorway, it had offered him enough hope to record it as a potential escape. It was Daniel's only lead. The stepped rocks loomed before him now, their surfaces carved with the same intricate symbols he'd seen in the cabin. As he moved between them, the air changed, growing dense, charged with same electric energy he'd felt at the grave and in the cabin, but magnified tenfold. Beyond the rocks, the forest opened into a perfect circular clearing. Its center stood a ring of standing stones, ancient and weathered, yet somehow pristine. In the center of the ring lay what appeared to be a well or shaft, its depths lost in shadow. Daniel approached cautiously. Holloway's doorway was clearly this stone circle, but doorway to what? The shaft in the center to descend into the earth itself, a vertical tunnel with crude handholds carved into its sides. As he studied it, the whispering began again, not from the forest this time, but from the shaft. Voices overlapping, urgent, familiar yet distorted. One voice rose above the others, achingly recognizable despite the years had passed since Daniel had heard it. Matthew's voice calling his name from the darkness below. "Matt?" Daniel's voice caught in his throat, a mixture of hope and terror twisting inside him. His brother's voice echoed again from the dark shaft, more plaintive now. "Danny, I've been waiting for you." Daniel staggered back from the edge, cold sweat breaking across his skin. It wasn't possible. 5 years had passed since Matthew disappeared in the Cascades, hundreds of miles from here. Search teams had combed those mountains for weeks. No trace was ever found. And yet, the ID card in his pocket, the compass. And now, voice, so achingly familiar it bypassed all his defenses, reaching directly into the grief he'd buried beneath layers of discipline and duty. "You're not real," Daniel whispered, more to himself than to the voice. "Whatever you are, you're not my brother." The voice fell silent. The whispering from the shaft ceased. For several heartbeats, the only sound was Daniel's ragged breathing and the pounding of his pulse in his ears. Then a figure emerged from the trees at the clearing's edge. Matthew stood there, not the grotesque approximation the entity had formed, but Matthew as Daniel remembered him. 23 years old, lean and athletic, with the same crooked smile and watchful eyes they'd both inherited from their father. He wore hiking gear, the same clothes he'd been wearing the day he disappeared. "Of course I'm real, Danny." Matthew took a step forward, his movements natural, human. "I got lost, found this valley, been trying to find a way out ever since." Daniel's training warred with his emotions. He kept his distance, weapon ready but not raised. "Is not possible. You vanished in Washington State." Matthew's expression shifted to confusion. "What? No, we were hiking the Appalachian Trail together. We got separated in a storm. Don't you remember?" A flicker of uncertainty rippled through Daniel's mind. Hadn't they been hiking the Appalachian Trail? He remembered planning the trip, but then Matthew had gone without him. Because Daniel had enlisted? No, wasn't right. They'd never hiked the Appalachian Trail together. Matthew had disappeared in the Cascades while hiking with friends. Daniel had been deployed overseas when it happened. Hadn't he? Daniel pressed his fingers to his temples. Memories, suddenly, fluid, contradicting each other. "You're doing this," he accused, eyes locked on the figure of his brother. "The valley, the entity. You're messing with my head." Matthew's face fell, hurt crossing his features. "Danny, it's me. I swear. I don't know what's happened to you, but we need to stick together. This place, it does things to your mind if you're alone too long." He extended a hand, taking another step forward. Daniel instinctively stepped back. "Stay where you are," he ordered, military authority hardening his voice. "If you're Matthew, tell me something only he would know." A sad smile crossed Matthew's face. "The night before you left for basic training, you told me you were scared. Not of combat, but of finding out you might enjoy it. You made me promise never to tell Dad." Daniel's breath caught. Was real. A private moment between brothers, something he'd never told anyone else. Yet doubt still gnawed at him. Holloway's journal had warned the entity could access memories, using them to manipulate its victims. "Doesn't prove anything," Daniel said, though his resolve was weakening. "If you can read my mind—" "I'm not reading your mind, Danny." Matthew sighed, lowering his hand. "I'm your brother. I've been trapped here for— I don't know how long. Time works differently. But I've been trying to find a way out." He gestured toward the stone circle. "I think this might be it. A doorway of kind. But I can't do it alone." Daniel's tactical mind assessed the situation, trying to separate emotion from strategy. If this was truly Matthew, leaving without him was unthinkable. If it was the entity, trying to lure him into a trap approaching could be fatal. But the chain in his pack had begun to vibrate again, pulling toward Matthew with unmistakable force. And something deep in Daniel's gut, the same instinct had kept him alive in combat, whispered, this was real, this was his brother. "How did you find this place?" Daniel asked, taking a tentative step forward. Relief washed over Matthew's face. "I followed the whispers. They led me here, like they led you." He glanced nervously at the trees. "But we're not alone. Something else is in this valley. Something doesn't want us to leave." As if summoned by his words, mist curled between the standing stones, thickening rapidly. The temperature plummeted, breath condensing before their faces. "We need to go," Matthew urged, real fear in his eyes. "Now, before it finds us. I've been hiding from it, but it always finds me eventually." Daniel hesitated only a moment longer, before making his decision. He crossed to Matthew's side, close enough to see the familiar flecks of gold in his brother's hazel eyes. Real or not, he couldn't reject this chance. "Lead the way," he said softly. Matthew nodded, relief evident in his posture. He turned and headed back into the forest, away from the stone circle. Daniel followed, keeping close but maintaining awareness of his surroundings. The chain in his pack had fallen silent again, neither pulling nor vibrating. They moved through the valley in silence for time, Matthew navigating with the confidence of someone who knew the terrain intimately. The path twisted and turned, sometimes disappearing entirely before re-emerging. Night was falling again, darkness pooling beneath the trees. "How long have you been here?" Daniel finally asked. Matthew glanced back, his expression difficult to read in the growing shadows. "Hard to say. Weeks? Months? Like I said, time doesn't work right here." "Have you seen others? A sheriff? Or a woman named Ellie?" Matthew shook his head. "Traces. Abandoned gear, footprints, and him." "Him?" "The man with the sewn mouth, at least he was a man once." Matthew's voice dropped to a whisper. "He follows me, watches me. Sometimes he wears my face, sometimes others. I think he's what's keeping us here." "The sealed one," Daniel murmured, remembering Holloway's journal. Matthew stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "You know about him?" "I found a journal in a cabin, written by someone named Holloway back in 1879. He mentioned the sealed one, a shaman who tried to step between worlds. His tribe bound him when he became dangerous." A troubled look crossed Matthew's face. "The cabin, I found it too. Read the journal. But was years ago and the cabin was barely standing then. It shouldn't still be there." Unease prickled along Daniel's spine. "I was there yesterday. Or, I think it was yesterday." "Then it's happening to you too." Matthew sighed. "The valley doesn't trap you physically. It traps moments, memories. Things happened. Things might have happened. They all exist here, simultaneously." "Doesn't make sense," Daniel protested, Though after everything he'd experienced, his skepticism rang hollow even to his own ears. Nothing here makes sense. Matthew resumed walking, his pace quickening. But I think I've figured out part of it. The sealed one needs something from us, from everyone who enters the valley. Is why he keeps us here playing with our minds, stretching time. What does he need? Matthew glanced back, his expression grim. A way out. A vessel. They crested a small rise, and Matthew pointed to a depression in the land ahead. Mist clung to it, unnaturally thick, but through the swirling vapor Daniel could make out stone structures, ruins of kind, half buried in the earth. Is where I'm taking you, Matthew said. I found it, well, time is weird, but recently. I think it's where the tribe performed the binding ritual. There might be answers there, a way to escape. As they descended toward the ruins, Daniel's compass spun wildly in his pocket, the needle whirling in complete circles. He pulled it out, watching its erratic movements. Yeah, happens here, Matthew said without looking back. All technology goes haywire, even simple things like compasses. Daniel stopped. A chill had nothing to do with the temperature running through him. He hadn't told Matthew he had a compass, hadn't shown it to him. Matt, he said carefully, how did you know I have a compass? Matthew froze mid-step, his back to Daniel. For a long moment he remained motionless. When he finally turned, his face wore an expression of concern. You took it out, Danny. I saw you. Daniel's hand tightened around the compass. No, I didn't take it out until after you mentioned it. Confusion flickered across Matthew's features. It's not right. I saw you. His voice trailed off and he pressed a hand to his forehead, wincing as if in pain. I'm sorry. I get confused sometimes. The valley does. Makes you see things wrong. The explanation was reasonable. After all, Daniel's own perception had proven unreliable since entering the valley. Yet doubt had taken root, impossible to dismiss. He studied his brother's face, searching for any sign of deception. It's okay, he said finally. Let's keep moving. Relief washed over Matthew's features. He turned and continued down the slope, moving more carefully now, as if conscious of being watched. Daniel followed, but his hand remained near his weapon. The chain in his pack had begun to vibrate again, a steady pulse to whisper caution. The ruins emerged from the mist as they approached, megalithic stones arranged in concentric circles, standing, others fallen. Symbols had been carved into their surfaces, similar to those in the cabin but more intricate, more deliberate. At the center stood what appeared to be an altar stone, its surface stained dark with what Daniel hoped wasn't blood. What is this place? He asked, voice hushed by instinctive reverence or fear. I think it's where they bound him, Matthew replied, stepping between the stones. The sealed one, where they performed the ritual, trapped him in the valley. Daniel moved more cautiously, studying the symbols as he passed. They to shift when viewed directly, lines rearranging themselves into new patterns. The effect was disorienting, nauseating. How do you know all this? Daniel asked, forcing his gaze away from the hypnotic carvings. Matthew had reached the altar stone. He placed his hands on its surface, fingers tracing patterns invisible to Daniel's eyes. I've had time to explore, to learn. But if this place traps people, messes with their minds, how do you know what's real? Matthew looked up, meeting Daniel's eyes across the altar. I don't. Not always. But things feel more real than others. He gestured around them. This place has power, I can feel it, can't you? Daniel could. The air hummed with energy, making his skin prickle and the hairs on his arms stand on end. The chain in his pack had grown almost painfully hot, vibrating with increasing intensity. The journal mentioned a doorway, Daniel said, approaching the altar. Is this it? Part of it. Matthew's expression grew solemn. The other part is in the chamber beneath the stone circle. The shaft you found. You knew about too? I told you I've been exploring, trying to find a way out. A shadow of irritation crossed Matthew's features. Why are you questioning everything I say? Don't you trust me? It's not simple, Matt. This place, it's done things to my mind. Made me see things can't be real. Like what? Matthew's tone softened, concern replacing irritation. Daniel hesitated, then decided honesty was his best strategy. Like you. My brother disappeared 5 years ago in Washington State. He couldn't possibly be here in Appalachia. Matthew's expression shifted, not to confusion or hurt, but to something calculating. There and gone so quickly, Daniel almost missed it. The valley doesn't trap people physically, Matthew said slowly. It traps moments, memories. Things become unstuck in time. It's what you said before, Daniel noted. But it doesn't explain how you could have physically traveled across the country without knowing it. I didn't. Matthew's eyes held Daniel's, unblinking. You didn't either. The implications of statement sent a chill through Daniel. Was it possible neither of them was in Appalachia? The valley existed somewhere outside normal geography, pulling in victims from across time and space? No, was impossible. Daniel had driven here, mapped his route, spoken with locals in Harlan's Creek. This was a real place in the physical world, wasn't it? What's in your pack? Matthew asked suddenly, his gaze dropping to where the chain pressed visibly against the fabric. Something's been moving in there since we met. Daniel instinctively stepped back, putting distance between himself and his brother. Nothing important. It's from the gravesite, isn't it? Matthew's voice had changed. A subtle alteration in cadence raised alarm bells in Daniel's mind. One of the binding chains. Daniel hadn't told him about the grave, about the chains. How do you know? He demanded, hand moving to his weapon. Matthew's expression remained neutral, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something dark and ancient and hungry. Because I've been waiting for someone to break those chains for a long time, brother. The word brother hung in the air between them. No longer an endearment, but something else. A designation. A role in ancient pattern. The same way the entity had pressed the word into Daniel's mind in the forest. Daniel's weapon was in his, hand now raised and aimed at the thing wearing his brother's face. You're not Matthew. A smile spread across Matthew's features, too wide, stretching the skin unnaturally at the corners. I am and I am not. As you are and are not Daniel Rains. What are you talking about? Daniel kept the weapon steady, though his mind reeled. The valley rewrites you, the creature said, using Matthew's voice but with undertones resonated at frequencies beyond human hearing. Until nothing remains but what it wants to keep. Did you never wonder why you were drawn to map unmapped places? Why you need to uncover what's hidden? Stop talking, Daniel ordered, backing away from the altar. The creature wore Matthew's face laughed. A sound started human but decayed into something else. Something made Daniel's ears ache and vision blur. You've been coming here your whole life, brother. Piece by piece, dream by dream. Each time you mapped a blank space, each time you sought what was lost, you were reaching toward this moment, toward me. I've never been here before, Daniel insisted, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his certainty. Hadn't of the terrain familiar when he first arrived? Hadn't he experienced déjà vu at certain vistas? Not in body, but in spirit, in dreams? The creature tilted Matthew's head, studying Daniel with eyes had begun to change, pupils elongating into vertical slits. Why do you think you became a cartographer after the military? Why do you think you were drawn to this valley, specifically? It was a job assignment. There are no coincidences in the valley, brother. Only convergence. The air around Matthew's form shimmer, his outline blurring. Beneath the familiar features, something else was emerging. The desiccated face from the grave, mouth no longer sewn shut but open in a silent scream. Daniel fired, the shot echoing through the stone circle. The bullet struck Matthew in the chest, but instead of blood, darkness poured from the wound, coiling like smoke. The creature staggered back, more surprised than hurt. Was unnecessary. Its voice had changed completely now, resonating from somewhere beyond Matthew's throat. "But I understand your fear. It is natural when facing what you do not yet comprehend." The darkness spilling from the wound-formed tendrils reached toward Daniel, stretching across the altar stone. Instinctively, he grabbed the chain from his back, holding it before him like a ward. The tendrils recoiled instantly, the creature hissing in pain or rage. Matthew's features distorted further, flickering between human and something else, something Daniel's mind couldn't properly process. "Belongs to me," it snarled, eyes fixed on the chain. "Return it, and I will show you your true brother." "My brother is dead," Daniel said, the words tearing from him, painful but necessary. "Whatever you're trying to do, it won't work." "Are you certain?" The creature's form stabilized, solidifying once more into Matthew. But a different Matthew, older than when he'd disappeared, gaunt and haunted. He came to this valley as you did, sought what was hidden, found more than he bargained for. It gestured, and the mist around them thickened, forming images. Matthew hiking along a ridge could have been the Cascades or the Appalachians. Matthew, finding a stone circle similar to the one Daniel had discovered. Matthew, descending into darkness. "He sought me out," the creature continued. "As you have. The difference is, he embraced what he found, accepted the gift I offered." "What gift?" Daniel asked, unable to tear his eyes from the misty visions of his brother. "Freedom from boundaries, from limitations." The creature spread Matthew's arms wide. "Your brother understood what you have not yet grasped. The valley doesn't imprison. It transcends. It transforms." The visions shifted, showing Matthew changing, his form growing fluid, his eyes taking on same vertical pupilled appearance, showing him moving through solid objects, traveling distances in the blink of an eye. "He became like me," the creature said, "as all who enter the valley eventually must. As you will." "No." Daniel tightened his grip on the chain, which had begun to glow faintly in the darkness. "I'm leaving this place, and I'm taking my brother with me, the real Matthew if he's still alive." The creature's expression hardened. "He is alive and not alive as I am, as you will be. The valley has already begun rewriting you, Daniel Rains. Haven't you noticed? Your memories shifting, your perception altering." It was true. Daniel could no longer clearly recall how he'd come to the valley or what his life had been before. Images blurred together, military service, mapping expeditions, searching for Matthew, which were real, which were implanted by this place. "The chain," the creature said, its voice softening to something almost gentle. "Give it to me, and I will show you where your brother truly is. I will reunite you." Daniel stared at the chain in his hand, gleaming with unnatural light. It felt significant in a way he couldn't articulate, a key to something profound and terrible. Whatever the creature was, whatever it wanted, the chain was important. It feared the chain, which meant Daniel needed to keep it. "No," he said firmly, backing away from the altar. "I don't believe you. I don't trust you." Rage contorted Matthew's features, inhuman in its intensity. "Then you condemn him to remain trapped. Condemn yourself as well." The creature lunged across the altar, faster than human reflexes could track. But Daniel had already turned, sprinting between the megalithic stones, chain clutched in his fist. Behind him, Matthew's voice distorted into something ancient and furious. The words, no longer English but something older, primal. The ground beneath Daniel's feet trembled. The standing stones shift, closing together like teeth. The mist thickened to near solidity, clawing at his limbs, slowing his escape. Ahead, barely visible through the supernatural fog, Daniel spotted a familiar shape. The shaft in the center of the stone circle. The doorway. His instinct screamed it was his only chance, the only way out, or the trap would finally spring shut around him. Behind him, the creature wore his brother's face was changing again, growing, expanding, its limbs elongating and multiplying. Its voice boomed across the valley, shaking the earth with its fury. "There is no escape, brother. The valley rewrites." Daniel reached the shaft, peering into its depths, Darkness yawned below, absolute and hungry. The handholds carved into its sides disappeared into blackness, leading to unknown horrors or salvation. The chain in his hand pulsed with light, pulling downward with unmistakable urgency. Whatever lay below was connected to it, and to the entity pursuing him. Daniel took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. Behind him, the creature's distorted form loomed through the mist, reaching for him with limbs defied anatomy and physics. Without looking back, Daniel swung himself into the shaft and descended, the chain lighting his way into the abyss. Above, the creature's howl of rage followed him down into the dark heart of the valley's secret. Darkness enveloped Daniel as he descended deeper into the shaft, the damp stone cold against his palms. Only the chain provided light. A faint pulsing glow illuminated enough to find the next handhold, the next foothold. Above, the entity's inhuman howls had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by Daniel's labored breathing and the occasional drip of water. How long he climbed down, he couldn't say. Time meaningless here, stretching and compressing like taffy pulled by unseen hands. His muscles burned with exertion, fingers numb from gripping rough stone. When he thought he couldn't continue, his foot touched solid ground. Daniel paused, letting his senses adjust. The air here was different. Staler, ancient, yet charged with the same unnatural energy he'd felt at the ritual site. The chain in his hand pulsed brighter, revealing a low tunnel stretching away from the base of the shaft. No way but forward. He moved cautiously, military training reasserting itself. The tunnel was roughly hewn at first, becoming more deliberately constructed as he progressed. Soon he was walking between walls of fitted stone, the floor smooth beneath his boots. Symbols had been carved into the surfaces, the same intricate patterns from the standing stones and the cabin, but older, more primitive in execution. The tunnel opened abruptly into a vast chamber, so large even the strengthening glow of the chain couldn't illuminate its boundaries. Daniel halted at the threshold, instinctively wary of the open space. As his eyes adjusted, details emerged from the gloom. Stone pillars rose to support a ceiling lost in darkness. Between them stood alcoves, dozens of them, each containing what appeared to be a seated figure. The floor was inlaid with intricate patterns, spirals and interconnected lines flowing toward a central dais. And bones. Everywhere. Bones. They lay scattered across the chamber floor, arranged in what might have been ritual formations, others carelessly piled as if discarded. Human remains, Daniel realized with growing horror. Hundreds of them. The chain pulled him forward, its glow intensifying as he approached the central dais. Despite every instinct screaming caution, Daniel followed its guidance, stepping carefully around the remains of those who had come before. On the dais sat a stone chair, not carved but seemingly grown from the living rock of the chamber. Before it stood a small altar, its surface stained dark with what could only be centuries of blood. Arranged around the altar were 7 chains identical to the one Daniel carried, forming a perfect circle. An empty space waited in circle, precisely sized for his chain. Daniel hesitated, understanding instinctively placing the chain in gap would be irreversible. He swept his gaze around the chamber instead, looking for any clue to what this place was, what ritual had been performed here. His light fell on the nearest alcove. The seated figure within was mummified, preserved by the dry air of the underground chamber. Unlike the corpse from the grave, this one wore no expression of horror. Its face was serene, accepting. Around its neck hung a pendant, carved from bone, marked with the same symbols adorned the walls. Daniel moved closer, examining the figure. It had been a man once, in his 30s when he died. His hands rested on his knees as if meditating. No signs of violence marked the body. A keeper, a voice whispered from the darkness, neither male nor female, but somehow both. One who chose to remain, to maintain the seal. Daniel whirled, weapon raised, but saw nothing beyond the chain's illumination. Who's there? Who indeed? The voice to come from everywhere and nowhere, I am what remains when the seal weakens, when the binding slips, when curious cartographers disturb what was meant to stay buried. The entity's words held no hostility. Only a weary resignation was somehow more disturbing than rage would have been. "Show yourself," Daniel demanded, turning slowly to scan the chamber. "I have shown myself, Daniel Rains. I have worn your brother's face. I have spoken with his voice. What more would you see?" A figure materialized from the shadows beyond the dais, humanoid but wrong in subtle, nauseating ways. It stood too, tall, its proportions distorted as if viewed through rippling water. Its face remained lost in shadow, but within darkness something shifted, formed, and dissolved continuously. "What are you?" Daniel asked, weapon still raised, though instinct told him bullets would be useless. "I am the valley," the entity replied. "Or the valley is me. After so long, it becomes difficult to distinguish where one ends and the other begins." It gestured around the chamber, the movement leaving trails of darkness in the air. "We are in the place of binding, where I was anchored to this world when I could no longer return to my own." "Your own world?" "There are spaces between spaces, Daniel. Gaps in what you perceive as reality. I sought to explore them, to walk between worlds as easily as you might step from room to room." A sound like distant thunder rolled through the chamber, the entity's approximation of a sigh. "But such journeys require tethers, anchors to prevent being lost in the in-between." The entity moved to the stone chair, not sitting but hovering beside it, form constantly shifting between almost human and definitively not. "The people of this valley feared what I discovered, what I became. They bound me here, not alive, not dead, but suspended between states." Its formless head tilted toward the chains. 7 elders sacrificed themselves willingly to create the binding. 7 chains forged from their sacrifice. 7 anchors to keep me from fully manifesting. Understanding dawned on Daniel, cold and terrible. "And I broke the binding when I took the chain from the grave." "You began the process," the entity corrected. "The binding weakens gradually, has been weakening for centuries as memory of its purpose faded. The chains were meant to be maintained, renewed by new keepers." It gestured to the mummified figures in the alcoves. "But humans forget. They move on. They build towns and cities and pretend the dark spaces on their maps don't matter." Daniel's mind raced, processing the implications. The people who disappeared in the valley became keepers, choosing to remain and maintain the binding. Others? The entity's form rippled, momentarily taking the shape of various human figures before dissolving back into amorphousness. Others contributed to my continued existence in other ways. Daniel suppressed a shudder, gaze falling to the bones scattered across the chamber floor. The entity had been feeding, sustaining itself on those who wandered into the valley. "And my brother? Was he one of your contributions?" The entity was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its voice had changed, becoming hauntingly familiar. Matthew's voice, but layered with others, distant and echoing. "Your brother never came to this valley, Daniel. But I found his backpack, his compass. Did you? Or did the valley show you what you expected to find? What would drive you deeper, make you more vulnerable?" The entity moved closer, its form solidifying slightly into something almost human. "The valley rewrites perception, reality. It shows people what will hurt them most deeply, what will make them easiest to claim." Daniel's certainty wavered. He'd been so sure he'd found proof of Matthew's presence. But if the entity could manipulate perception, then Matthew never disappeared here? He's not trapped in the valley? "I did not say." The entity's form shifted again, and for a brief moment, Daniel saw his brother's face emerge from the darkness. Not as the entity had worn it before, but transparent like a photograph projected onto smoke. Matthew Rains walked between worlds 5 years ago. Not here, but in mountains far from this place. He found a thin spot, a place where the boundaries weaken naturally. The projection of Matthew's face looked peaceful, almost transcendent. He stepped through, not understanding what waited on the other side, not understanding humans are not meant to walk such paths without preparation, without anchors. The entity's voice held something like regret. He was lost between, neither here nor there, neither alive nor dead. Grief, fresh and raw despite the years, welled up in Daniel. So he is dead. Death is a boundary, Daniel, a threshold between states of being. Your brother exists beyond such simple delineations now. Cold comfort, if comfort at all. Daniel struggled to process what he was being told, to separate truth from manipulation. Why are you telling me this? What do you want? The entity's form stabilized further. Resolving into a figure was neither Matthew nor the corpse from the grave, but something new. A tall, gaunt human with features to incorporate elements of every face the entity had worn. I want what all sentient beings want, Daniel. Freedom. Purpose. It gestured to the chamber around them. I have been bound here for centuries, neither fully in this world nor able to return to my own. The binding weakens, but I cannot break it myself. You need me to do it, Daniel concluded, to remove the last chain. Yes and no. The entity moved to the altar, hovering one hand over the circle of chains. The binding can be broken or it can be renewed. Both require the same thing. Blood freely given by one who carries the right. Resonance. Resonance? Humans are attuned to the spaces between, sensitive to the thinning of boundaries. Your brother was one. You are another. It runs in bloodlines, this sensitivity. The entity's featureless face turned toward Daniel. Why do you think you became a cartographer? What draws you to the blank spaces on maps, Daniel Rains? What compels you to seek what others cannot see? The question struck deeper than Daniel cared to admit. All his life he'd felt drawn to the unknown, the unmapped, had felt a visceral need to fill in blank spaces, to know what lay beyond horizons. He'd attributed it to curiosity, to a desire for order and understanding. But what if it was something else? Something inherited, encoded in his blood? I don't understand what you're asking me to do, Daniel said, though a part of him feared. He understood all too well. The binding must be resolved, the entity replied. Either completed anew or broken entirely. The former requires a keeper, one who will remain here maintaining the seal, ensuring I remain trapped in this half-existence. It gestured to the mummified figures in the alcoves. The latter requires sacrifice of a different kind. Blood will release me fully into your world, or return me to my own. And if I refuse both options? Then the valley claims you anyway. The entity's voice hardened. The binding is already weakening, has been since you removed the chain. Even now, the valley shifts, reality thins. Soon it will begin to affect the world beyond. Dreams becoming waking nightmares, boundaries between possible and impossible dissolving. What has been contained here will spread. Daniel looked down at the chain in his hand, glowing with ethereal light. Such a small thing to hold such terrible power, such awful choice. You expect me to trust you? After everything you've done, wearing my brother's face, trying to manipulate me? I expect you to recognize truth when you hear it, Daniel Rains. The entity's form dissolve again, edges blurring into darkness. The valley has shown you its nature, has given you evidence of what happens when the binding fails. It gestured, and suddenly the walls of the chamber became translucent, revealing scenes etched in light. Holloway wandering endlessly through shifting landscapes. Sheriff Wallace's father encountering a dark presence in the trees. Ellie's grandmother, finding an unmarked grave and making a terrible choice. And Matthew, standing before a shimmer in the air on a mountain trail, reaching toward it with fatal curiosity. Blood calls to blood, Daniel. The valley called your brother. Now it calls you. The only question is how you will answer. The visions faded, leaving Daniel alone with the entity in the chamber of bones. Understanding crystallized within him, terrible and absolute. There had never been coincidence in his assignment to map this valley. never random chance in his discovery of the grave. He had been drawn here, as his brother had been drawn to shimmer between worlds on a distant mountain trail. Matthew wasn't meant to be taken, Daniel whispered, realization dawning. I was, the entity acknowledged. It was always meant to be you who faced this choice. Or the valley takes what it can get, when boundaries thin and opportunities arise. Daniel looked around the chamber, at the bones of those who had come before, at the mummified keepers in their alcoves. All of them had faced this same choice, in one form or another. All had been drawn here by the same inherited sensitivity to the spaces between. If I choose to become a keeper, he asked slowly, what happens? I stay here, maintaining the binding until I die? And then what? The binding weakens again? Someone else gets drawn in to face the same choice? Is the nature of the binding, the entity confirmed. It requires constant maintenance, constant sacrifice. The alternative is letting you free, Daniel finished. Unleashing whatever you are onto the world. Or returning me to my own realm, the entity countered, ending this cycle permanently. And I'm supposed to believe you'd leave? After centuries of imprisonment, you'd go home? The entity's form rippled, edges blurring further. Belief is irrelevant, Daniel Rains. The choice remains the same, regardless of what you believe my intentions to be. Daniel's mind raced, searching for a third option, an escape from the binary choice presented. But everywhere his thoughts turned, the same conclusion waited. There was no leaving the valley without resolving the binding, one way or another. The chain in his hand pulsed brighter, responding to his turmoil. Its light illuminated carvings on the altar he hadn't noticed before, depictions of the original binding ritual. 7 elders, their blood flowing into 7 chains. A figure, caught between worlds, neither fully manifested nor fully banished. A valley sealed away from the rest of reality, a prison and container in one. And there, at the edge of the carving, a small detail made Daniel's breath catch. A figure observing, the ritual, marked with a symbol he recognized. The same symbol carved into the pendant worn by the mummified keeper in the alcove. His free hand moved to his chest, to the birthmark he'd carried all his life. A pattern of discolored skin he'd never thought significant. A pattern identical to symbol. I'm not sensitive to the spaces between, he said slowly. I'm descended from them, from the people who created the binding in the first place. Yes. The entity's voice held satisfaction, as if pleased by his deduction. The burden of maintenance falls to those bloodlines first. The valley calls to its own. The horror of inherited fate settled over Daniel like a shroud. He hadn't stumbled into this situation by accident or bad luck. He'd been born for it. His path predetermined by ancestors he'd never known existed. This is why Matthew was drawn to Thin Spot in the mountains, he realized aloud. Why I became a cartographer. Why I feel compelled to map blank spaces. It's all been leading to this moment, this choice. You understand now. The entity moved closer, its form solidifying once more into the gaunt, featureless figure. So, choose Daniel Rains. Become a keeper and maintain my prison, or complete the breaking and face what follows. Daniel stared down at the chain, at the empty space in the circle on the altar. Slowly, realization dawned. Not a way out, but a way forward neither the entity nor the original binders had anticipated. There's a third option, he said quietly. Isn't there? The entity went still, its formless head tilting in what might have been curiosity or concern. The binding doesn't trap you, Daniel continued, pieces falling into place. It traps the valley itself, keeps it separate from the rest of the world. It's why reality shifts here, why time and space don't work. Normally, the valley isn't your prison. It's an entire pocket of reality caught between worlds. What are you suggesting? The entity's voice had lost its certainty, a note of wariness entering it. Daniel looked at the mummified keeper, at the symbol on the pendant. The symbol matched his birthmark. The keepers didn't maintain your binding. They maintained the boundary between this pocket reality and the outside world. Kept both separated. He stepped toward the altar, decision crystallizing within him. I don't have to free you or keep you imprisoned. There's another choice. Daniel Rains, the entity began, a note of alarm entering its voice. Whatever you're contemplating. I can collapse the boundary, Daniel interrupted. Not free, you. Not maintain your prison but end the valley itself. Return this entire pocket of reality to the void it came from. The entity's form destabilized completely, dissolving into a roiling darkness spread across the ceiling of the chamber. You would destroy yourself in the process. This entire space would cease to exist, everything and everyone within it. Including you, Daniel noted. And me. And any future victims the valley might claim. He held up the chain, its light blazing, now as if responding to his resolve. Blood calls to blood. My ancestors created this binding, means I have the right to end it, not by maintaining or breaking it, but by collapsing it entirely. The entity's darkness contracted, condensing into a semi-humanoid form loomed over Daniel. You cannot. You do not understand the consequences. I understand enough. Daniel locked eyes with what passed for the entity's face. You said yourself the binding is weakening. Soon what's contained here will begin to affect the outside world. I'm ending possibility, permanently. The chamber trembled, dust and small stones raining from the unseen ceiling. The bones on the floor rattled against stone. The entity's form flickered erratically, its voice distorting. The valley has always existed, will always exist. You cannot— I can, Daniel interrupted, and I will. He stepped forward and placed the chain in the empty space in the circle, completing it. Instead of falling into place, however, he twisted it, breaking the perfect symmetry of the arrangement. The other chains responded immediately, their metal screeching as they twisted in sympathy. Disrupting the pattern had maintained the binding for centuries. The entity howled. A sound contained the voices of everyone it had ever consumed, ever mimicked. It lunged toward Daniel, darkness extending like talons, but it was too late. Daniel pressed his palm against the altar, blood from cuts on his fingers smearing the ancient stone. By blood begun, by blood undone, he whispered, the words coming from somewhere beyond conscious thought. Knowledge inherited, then learned. Light exploded from the chains, blinding in its intensity. The floor beneath Daniel's feet cracked, fissures spreading outward like lightning. The entity's form shattered into fragments, each containing a different face, a different memory. All dispersing like smoke and wind. The chamber collapsed around him, reality itself folding inward. Through the disintegrating walls, Daniel caught glimpses of the valley above. Trees bending impossibly, the sky folding into itself, the fabric of the pocket reality unraveling. In his last moments of consciousness, as the void rushed in to reclaim what had been artificially separated from it, Daniel saw Matthew, not the entity's approximation, but his brother as he truly had been. Matthew smiled, a look of peace on his face, and extended a hand. It's okay, Danny, he said, voice clear despite the chaos around them. You found me. You can let go now. Daniel reached toward his brother's outstretched hand as darkness claimed him, the valley's secret finally undone. Light. Blinding, ordinary sunlight. Daniel blinked, raising a hand to shield his eyes. He lay on his back, looking up at a blue sky visible through a canopy of normal, undistorted trees. For several moments he breathed, reorienting himself to a reality followed proper rules. He sat up slowly, body aching as if he'd fallen from a considerable height. Looking around, he found himself in a shallow depression in the earth. Natural, not man-made. No sign remained of the shaft, the underground chamber, or the altar. Of the entity, nothing remained either. Daniel climbed to his feet, checking himself for injuries. Apart from bruises and exhaustion, he intact. His pack still hung from his shoulders, though the chain was gone, as if it had never existed. Had any of it existed? Or had it all been hallucination, dream, delusion? But when Daniel checked his GPS, the date showed he'd been in the valley for 3 days. And when he activated the mapping function, he found himself standing in a completely unremarkable section of Appalachian forest. No indication of the valley had trapped him. No evidence of supernatural distortion. It was gone, as if it had never been. With trembling fingers, Daniel pulled out his brother's compass. The one thing remained from his ordeal. It pointed steadily north, no longer spinning or behaving erratically. Whatever had warped reality in the valley had disappeared completely. He needed to get back to town, to find Ellie, to tell her what had happened, or at least what he thought had happened. Whether she would believe him was another matter entirely. Daniel oriented himself using the compass and began walking. The forest around him was normal in every way. Birds called, insects hummed, sunlight filtered through leaves and patterns followed proper physics. No mist, no whispers, no distortions. As he hiked, memories of the underground chamber fade, details blurring as if his mind couldn't hold on to them. By the time he spotted the first trail marker indicating he was approaching Harlan's Creek, the specifics of his conversation with the entity had become hazy, dreamlike. But one thing remained clear: the certainty he had ended something ancient and terrible. Whatever had been trapped in Valley would never claim another victim. And somewhere, somehow, his brother was at peace. Daniel emerged from the tree line, the small town of Harlan's Creek visible in the valley below. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for questions he couldn't fully answer, for skepticism he couldn't entirely overcome. But first he needed to find Ellie. If anyone would understand, would believe, it would be her. He began the descent toward town, the weight of the valley's secret lifting with each step. Behind him, the forest stood unremarkable, showing no sign of the horrors it had contained hours before. No sign a cartographer had collapsed a pocket of reality, erasing an ancient evil from existence. Trees and sky and stone. A blank space on the map, waiting to be filled in with ordinary truth. Daniel staggered down Harlan's Creek's main street, drawing concerned glances from the few locals out in the late afternoon sun. He must have been a sight, clothes torn and filthy, face gaunt from days without proper food, eyes haunted by things no human should witness. His hand gripped Matthew's, compass so tightly his knuckles had gone white, as if it might vanish if he loosened his hold. The memory of what had happened in the valley was already fading, details growing hazy at the edges. But the certainty remained. He had collapsed the pocket reality, erased the entity and its prison from existence. So why did unease still coil in his gut? Why did his skin still crawl with the sensation of being watched? Ellie's diner came into view, its neon sign blinking erratically in the daylight. Daniel pushed through the door, the bell chiming his arrival. The few customers inside fell silent, staring. Behind the counter, Ellie froze mid-pour, coffee overflowing the cup she was filling. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, eyes widening as she took in his appearance. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but exhaustion caught up with him in a sudden wave. His knees buckled. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Ellie vaulting over the counter with unexpected agility, rushing to catch him before he hit the floor. Dreams came in jagged fragments. The underground chamber, bones shifting to form patterns on the floor. Matthew's face, peaceful one moment, contorted in agony the next. The entity's final howl as reality collapsed around it. And beneath it all, a rhythmic pulsing, like the beating of a heart too large to belong to any living creature. Daniel jerked awake with a gasp, disoriented. He lay on a couch in an unfamiliar room, a handmade quilt tucked around him. Books lined the walls, ancient volumes with worn leather bindings next to modern academic texts. Maps covered nearly every remaining surface, yellowed with age, others freshly marked with neat annotations. "Welcome back." Ellie sat in an armchair across from him, a steaming mug cradled in her hands. Another waited on the coffee table beside him. "You've been out for about 4 hours." Daniel pushed himself upright, wincing as his body protested. "Where am I?" My home. She gestured to the room around them. Also my research space. I study local folklore, among other things. The academic nature of her surroundings surprised him. He'd pegged her as a diner owner with superstitious leanings, not a scholar. You collapsed in my diner, Ellie continued. Caused a stir. I told everyone you'd gotten lost hiking and were suffering from exposure. She studied him over the rim of her mug. But's not what happened, is it? Daniel ran a hand across his face, feeling the stubble of days without shaving. I don't know how to explain what happened. I'm not sure I understand it myself. Try me. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were intense, watchful. You went into the valley. You found something there, and somehow, impossibly, you came back. Daniel reached for the mug on the table, grateful for something to hold, something real and warm and ordinary. I found a grave, he began, with chains, and a corpse wasn't dead. Ellie didn't look surprised. If anything, she'd be waiting for him to continue, as if checking his account against information she already possessed. I broke the binding, Daniel admitted, took one of the chains. After, everything changed. The valley itself shifting, reality bending, and the entity. He broke off, images flickering through his mind too fast to articulate. The sealed one, Ellie supplied softly. My grandmother called it. It could take different shapes, wear different faces. Daniel's hands tightened around the mug. It wore my brother's face. Ellie leaned forward. Your brother? Matthew. He disappeared 5 years ago, hiking in Washington State. Daniel pulled the compass from his pocket, placing it on the table between them. I found this in the valley. It was his. The entity claimed he found a thin spot in reality, similar to the valley. He stepped through and was lost between worlds. Ellie picked up the compass, examining it carefully. And you believe? I don't know what to believe anymore. Daniel took a sip of the tea, the heat and normalcy grounding him. The entity said I had the same sensitivity to these boundary spaces. It runs in bloodlines. Something flickered across Ellie's face. Recognition or confirmation. Go on. I found an underground chamber, full of bones and mummified bodies. Keepers, the entity called them. People who chose to stay and maintain the binding. Daniel paused, unsure how to explain what came next. I learned the valley itself was a pocket of reality, artificially separated from the void. The entity was trapped there by my ancestors. Your ancestors? Ellie's gaze sharpened. Daniel pulled down the collar of his shirt, revealing the birthmark. On his chest, the symbol matched the pendant worn by the keeper in the alcove. Apparently, I'm descended from the original binders, the ones who created the ritual to trap the entity. Ellie inhaled sharply, setting down her mug with careful precision. What did you do in chamber, Daniel? I collapsed it. The words came, out flat, matter-of-fact, despite their impossible meaning. Not the binding, the entire pocket reality. I used the chain to disrupt the pattern, unravel the space itself, the entity, the valley, all of it, gone. And yet here you are. Ellie murmured, studying him with new intensity, somehow intact. I woke up in the forest, no sign of the valley, the shaft, any of it. Daniel met her gaze directly. It's over. Whatever was trapped there is gone. Ellie was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she set her mug down and stood, moving to a bookshelf. She selected a volume bound in cracked leather, its pages yellow with age. My grandmother's journal, she explained, returning to her seat. She was the last official keeper of our family line. Did the entity mention bloodlines on both sides? Those who created the binding and those who maintained it? Daniel nodded slowly. It said the valley calls to its own. My family has watched over valley for generations, Ellie said, opening the journal to a marked page. We don't share the blood of the original binders, but we were chosen by them to serve as watchers, to ensure the binding remained intact, to guide those with binder, blood who might be drawn to the valley. She turned the journal toward him. On the page was a drawing of the same symbol as his birthmark, accompanied by neat flowing script. The mark of the 7. Those who bear it descend from the original council who performed the binding ritual. They're the only ones who can fundamentally alter the binding, strengthen it, break it, or apparently collapse it entirely. Daniel stared at the familiar symbol, pieces falling into place. Your grandmother, she disappeared in the valley. Was she trying to maintain the binding? Pain flickered across Ellie's features. She sensed it weakening. Went to perform the renewal ritual. Never returned. She closed the journal carefully. The binding requires blood, freely given, but given nonetheless. I think she sacrificed herself to buy more time when no one with binder blood appeared. The implications settled heavily on Daniel. If he had arrived earlier, Ellie's grandmother wouldn't have needed to make sacrifice. I'm sorry, he said softly. Ellie shook her head. She made her choice, as did you, it seems. She leaned back, studying him with same intense gaze. Though I've never heard of anyone collapsing the pocket reality entirely, it shouldn't be possible to erase it. It's gone, Daniel insisted. I felt it collapse. I saw the entity disperse. And yet, Ellie gestured toward his hand, which had been unconsciously rubbing at his chest right over the birthmark. You still feel it, don't you? The connection, the pull. Daniel denied it, then stopped. The unease had followed him from the forest hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger since he'd awoken on Ellie's couch. It's impossible, he whispered. The valley is gone. Is it? Ellie reached for his compass, opening it again. May I? At Daniel's nod, she placed the compass on the table between them. The needle spun lazily, then steadied, pointing not north, but directly at Daniel's chest. Cold dread washed through him. What is happening? Ellie's expression was grim. You didn't destroy the valley, Daniel, you absorbed it. What? The pocket reality couldn't be erased. Much metaphysical energy has to go somewhere. She pointed to his birthmark. You bear the mark of the 7. You have binder blood. When you disrupted the pattern, the valley didn't collapse into nothing, it collapsed into you. Daniel stood abruptly, backing away from the table, from Ellie, from the implications of her words. It's not possible. Look at your shadow, Ellie said quietly. Daniel glanced down. His shadow stretched across the floor, normal, except for a subtle distortion around its edges, a rippling as if the darkness was not solid. No, he whispered, panic rising. No, I ended it. I destroyed the entity. Did you? Ellie remained seated, watching him with a mixture of pity and wariness. Or did you change its container? Daniel pressed his back against the wall, trying to process what she was suggesting. I haven't been possessed? I'd know. Not possession, Ellie corrected. Transformation. The valley was a space between worlds. Now you are. The room to tilt around him. Daniel closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. When he opened them again, his gaze fell on a mirror hanging on the opposite wall. His reflection stared back, haggard, exhausted, but human. Except, behind him, barely visible, stood another figure. Tall, gaunt, features constantly shifting. As Daniel watched in horror, it raised a hand in perfect synchronization with his own. No, he breathed, stumbling away from the mirror. This isn't happening. The entity isn't separate from you anymore, Ellie said, rising slowly from her chair. It's becoming you, or you're becoming it. The distinction may not matter at this point. Daniel turned to her, desperation clawing at his throat. How do I stop it? I don't know if you can. Her voice was gentle but firm. No one has ever done what you did before. This is uncharted territory. There has to be a way. Daniel's mind raced, searching for options, for hope. Your grandmother's journal. Does it say anything about reversing a binding? Ellie hesitated, then nodded slowly. Theoretically, yes, but it would require returning to the valley, to the original, binding sight. But the valley is gone, Daniel protested, then froze as understanding dawned. Unless it's not gone at all. Ellie finished for him. Relocated, inside you. The implications were staggering. If Ellie was right, if the valley and all its horrors had somehow been internalized within him. I can feel it, Daniel admitted, the words barely audible. Since I woke up in the forest, like something moving under my skin, I thought it was trauma, the aftermath of what I experienced. It's more than... Ellie moved to another bookshelf, selecting several volumes. My grandmother documented similar cases, not identical but related. People who carried pieces of the entity within them after encounters in the valley. What happened to them? Daniel asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Ellie's silence was answer enough. How long do I have? He asked finally. I don't know. She met his gaze directly. The transformation has already begun. How quickly it progresses probably depends on how strongly you resist. Daniel laughed hollowly. Great. So my options are to fight a losing battle against an ancient entity rewriting my existence, or we find a way to transfer it back to its original container, Ellie finished. Reconstitute the valley, rebuild the binding properly this time. Can even be done? Ellie spread her hands. I don't know, but my grandmother's journals might give us somewhere to start. A sharp rap at the door interrupted them. Ellie frowned, checking her watch. I'm not expecting anyone. She moved to the door, peering through the peephole. Her shoulders tensed instantly. Sheriff Wallace, she muttered, turning back to Daniel. This isn't good. Another knock, more insistent. Ms. Graves, I know you're in there. Open up. Ellie's gaze flicked to Daniel, then to the books spread across her coffee table. Bathroom's down the hall, she whispered. Stay quiet. Daniel retreated as instructed, leaving the door cracked so he could hear the conversation. Ellie opened the front door. Sheriff, what brings you by? You know why I'm here, Ellie. Wallace's voice was gruff. Word is our surveyor showed up at your diner looking like he'd been through hell. Now he's mysteriously disappeared again. He was exhausted. I helped him to the clinic. Ellie lied smoothly. Dr. Pearson's looking after him. Funny, because I came from the clinic. No sign of any surveyors there. Wallace's voice hardened. You want to try again? From his hiding place, Daniel could see Ellie's posture stiffen. What do you want, Tom? I want to know what happened in Valley. The sheriff's voice dropped lower. Like I want to know what happened to my father, and your grandmother, and all the others who've disappeared over the years. We've had this conversation before, Ellie replied coldly. You never believe me. Try me now. Wallace pushed past her into the living room, his gaze sweeping the space. It lingered on the books and maps spread across the coffee table. Still collecting ghost stories, I see. Family tradition. Ellie closed the door but remained standing, clearly wanting the sheriff to leave. If you're looking for Rains, I can't help you. He left the clinic against medical advice. Said something about heading back to the valley. Wallace snorted. If he went back in there, he's a fool. I thought you didn't believe in curses and sealed ones, Ellie remarked, a slight edge to her voice. The sheriff's expression darkened. I believe in facts. And the fact is, people go into Valley and don't come out. I don't need superstition to know it's dangerous. He moved to the coffee table, examining the open books. Daniel tensed when the sheriff picked up his brother's compass. Interesting piece, Wallace commented. Old. Good craftsmanship. Family heirloom, Ellie said shortly, taking it from him and slipping it into her pocket. Wallace studied her for a long moment. You're hiding something, Ellie. You always have been. Your grandmother had the same look, like she knew something the rest of us weren't privy to. My grandmother was a folklorist, Ellie replied evenly. She collected stories people found threatening. She was more than... Wallace moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. The night before she disappeared, she came to my father, told him something was stirring in the valley. Something had been dormant for generations. Said she needed his help. Daniel leaned closer to the crack in the door, surprised by this revelation. My father didn't believe in the supernatural, Wallace continued, but he believed in her. He went into valley with her, and only she came back out. 3 days later, she went in again, never returned. He turned back to face Ellie. I want to know what she found, what she told you. Ellie's expression remained carefully neutral. She didn't tell me anything. Bullshit. Wallace's voice rose slightly. Your family has been the keepers of Valley's secrets for generations. She would have passed knowledge to you. From his hiding place, Daniel felt a sudden shift. A ripple of wrongness passed through him like a wave. His shadow on the bathroom wall elongated, stretching impossibly up the tiled surface. Whispers filled his ears, familiar and terrible. He knows too much. He suspects. He will interfere. Daniel pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the voice came from within his own mind. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed his face beginning to shift, features melting and reforming. He will stop us from returning, from reclaiming our domain. Stop, Daniel whispered, fighting to maintain control. You don't control me. His reflection smiled with too many teeth. Don't I? We are becoming one, Daniel Rains. Your will and mine, inseparable. In the living room, the conversation between Ellie and the sheriff grew more heated. My father kept records, Wallace was saying. Notes about the valley, about disappearances dating back 100 years. After he vanished, I found them. Started putting pieces together. And what pieces are those? Ellie asked, voice carefully, controlled. Certain families in this area have connections to the valley. Your family and a handful of others have been covering up whatever's happening there. Wallace leaned closer to her. And our new surveyor friend is somehow connected to all of it. His name was on a list in my father's notes. Rains. Not him specifically, but the family name. Daniel's blood ran cold. The sheriff knew more than he'd let on initially. The law enforcement facade was a cover for his own investigations into the valley's secrets. The entity within him stirred again, stronger this time. He will prevent the reconstitution. We must silence him. Daniel felt his body begin to move without his conscious control, hand reaching for the doorknob. With tremendous effort, he fought against the impulse, pressing his back against the wall, focusing on his breathing. You, cannot resist for long, the entity whispered. The valley claims its own. In the living room, Wallace's voice had taken on a new urgency. People are disappearing again, Ellie. 3 hikers in the last month. The pattern's repeating. Whatever happened when your grandmother and my father went into valley, it's happening again. And I think your surveyor friend triggered it. Sheriff, Ellie said firmly, I appreciate your concern, but this is all speculation. Daniel Rains got lost hiking. Is all. Is it? Wallace challenged. Then why are you hiding him? Daniel froze. So did Ellie, based on the sudden silence from the living room. I don't know what you're talking about, she said finally. 2 coffee mugs on your table, Wallace pointed out. Both used. You live alone. And your back door is unlocked, which it never is. You've got him stashed somewhere in this house. Daniel felt the entity surge within him, pushing against his control with renewed force. His vision doubled, the bathroom overlaying with images of the underground chamber, bones shifting across the floor. He threatens everything. The entity hissed. Let me protect us. No, Daniel growled through gritted teeth. Unfortunately, his denial was audible enough to catch Wallace's attention. The sheriff's head snapped toward the hallway. Who's there? He called, hand moving to his sidearm. Daniel knew he had seconds before his hiding place was discovered, and seconds more before the entity overtook him completely. He needed to make a choice: hide and hope the sheriff left, or confront this new complication directly. The decision was made for him as Wallace strode toward the hallway, weapon half drawn. "Come out now!" Daniel stepped from the bathroom, hands raised. "Sheriff, I can explain." Wallace's eyes widened at the sight of him, and Daniel realized what the sheriff must be seeing. Not an exhausted surveyor, but a man in the midst of transformation. His shadow stretched behind him, elongated and distorted. His face felt wrong, features not where they should be. "Jesus Christ," Wallace breathed, drawing his weapon fully. "What the hell happened to you?" "The valley," Daniel managed, fighting to maintain control of his voice, his form. "You were right. Something's there. Something old." "Daniel," Ellie warned, moving cautiously toward them. "Stay calm." Wallace's gaze darted between them. "You know what's happening to him," he accused Ellie. "You know exactly what this is." "I'm trying to help him," Ellie replied, her voice steady despite the tension. "But you need to put gun down. It won't help the situation." "The hell it won't." Wallace kept his weapon trained on Daniel. "Whatever's happening to him, it isn't natural. And I'm betting it's the same thing happened to my father before he disappeared." Daniel felt the entity coiling within him, gathering strength for another push. He pressed a hand to the wall, steadying himself. "Sheriff," he said, forcing each word through the interference in his mind. "You need to listen to Ellie. The gun won't help, but she might be able to fix this." "Fix what exactly?" Wallace demanded. "What are you becoming?" "The valley," Daniel answered. "I absorbed it somehow. The pocket reality, the entity trapped within it. It's all inside me now. And it's trying to take over." Wallace's expression might have been comical under other circumstances, disbelief warring with the evidence before his eyes. "It's not possible." "Look at him, Tom," Ellie said quietly. "Look at what's happening. Is it so hard to believe my grandmother was right all along? There are things in this world beyond ordinary explanation." The sheriff's resolve wavered visibly. His weapon lowered slightly as he took in Daniel's distorted shadow, the subtle shifting of his features. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then my father was probably trying to help my grandmother maintain the binding," Ellie finished. "And now it's failing completely." Daniel disrupted it, thinking he was destroying the entity. Instead, he internalized it. Wallace holstered his weapon, though his posture remained wary. "How do we stop it?" "We need to return to the valley," Ellie said. "Or to where the valley was. Daniel believes he collapsed it, but I think he relocated it inside himself." "And what, we're supposed to put it back?" Wallace shook his head. "If this thing is as dangerous as you say, why would we want to reconstitute it at all? Why not?" He didn't finish the thought, but his glance toward his holstered weapon made his meaning clear enough. "Because killing me won't destroy it," Daniel said, the certainty coming from somewhere beyond his conscious knowledge. "It would release it unbound into the world. At least the valley contained it." "He's right," Ellie confirmed. "The binding kept it isolated, prevented it from affecting the outside world. If it's released without a container..." Wallace ran a hand over his face, the gesture revealing his exhaustion. "This is insane. All of it. And yet here we are," Ellie replied. "Will you help us or not?" Before Wallace could answer, Daniel felt another surge within him, stronger than before, nearly overwhelming. His vision swam, reality bending around him, the walls of Ellie's home to breathe, to pulse with unnatural life. "It's getting stronger," he gasped, doubling over. "I can't hold it back much longer." Ellie rushed to his side, supporting him. "Daniel, listen to me. Focus on my voice. You need to maintain control until we can reach the binding site." "What happens if he loses control before then?" Wallace asked, moving cautiously closer. "Then the entity takes over," Ellie said grimly, "and we lose Daniel entirely." Daniel straightened with effort, forcing his lungs to draw air, his heart to maintain its rhythm. "How long will it take to reach the site?" "A few hours' hike," Ellie estimated, "assuming the trail is still there." "It will be," Daniel said. knowledge coming from the entity itself. The physical landscape remains. Only the pocket reality is gone. We should go now, Wallace decided, surprising them both, before it gets any stronger. Ellie nodded. I need to gather things first. Supplies, my grandmother's journals. As she moved to collect what they needed, Wallace stepped closer to Daniel, voice dropping to ensure only he could hear. If you start to lose control, if Thing takes over, I will put you down. I won't let whatever happened to my father happen to anyone else. Are we clear? Daniel met his gaze steadily. Completely. In fact, I'm counting on it. Wallace studied him for a moment, then nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. Ellie returned with a backpack, Matthew's compass clutched in her hand. Ready? Daniel felt the entity stir again at the sight of the compass, a wave of recognition and hunger washing through him. As ready as I can be. As they stepped outside into the gathering dusk, Daniel caught his reflection in Ellie's front window. For a split second, another face overlaid his own, not the entity's amorphous form, but Matthew's, watching him with solemn understanding. The way out is through, Danny. Whether the thought came from the entity, from remnant of his brother, or from his own fractured psyche, Daniel couldn't tell. But as they set off toward where the valley had been, he clung to those words like a lifeline. The way out is through. One way or another, this would end tonight. Night had fallen by the time they reached the trailhead, the forest a wall of darkness, beyond their flashlights' beams. Daniel walked between Ellie and Sheriff Wallace, each step requiring conscious effort to keep his body moving forward while the entity inside him fought to turn back. Its whispers had become a constant soundtrack in his mind, promises and threats intermingling until he could hardly distinguish one from the other. They're leading you to your doom. They'll bind us both. Trap us forever. You holding up? Ellie asked, noticing his faltering pace. Daniel nodded tightly. It knows where we're going, what we're planning. It's not happy about it. Can it hear us? Wallace asked, hand resting on his holstered weapon. Understand what we're saying? Yes, Daniel admitted. It's inside me, but still separate. For now. The sheriff's expression hardened. Then it knows I'll put a bullet in you if it takes control. Tom, Ellie warned, is not helping. No, he's right, Daniel said. It needs to understand there are consequences. Limitations. He met Wallace's gaze. It's afraid of you. Of what you represent. Good. Wallace replied grimly. They continued in silence, following the beam of Ellie's flashlight. The trail normal, at first, the same path Daniel had taken days earlier. But as they ventured deeper, subtle changes became apparent. Trees stood at impossible angles, their trunks twisting in ways defied natural growth. The ground beneath their feet sometimes felt wrong, too soft, then suddenly hard as iron, as if the consistency of reality itself was becoming unstable. This isn't right, Wallace muttered, staring at a boulder to shift position when not directly observed. These landmarks weren't here before. The valley is reconstituting itself, Ellie explained, consulting her grandmother's journal by flashlight, bleeding out from Daniel back into the physical world. Daniel felt the truth of her words. Each step they took deeper into the forest, to relieve of the pressure inside him, as if parts of the entity were sloughing off, returning to their original domain. But with relief came a growing unease. The forest around them was becoming less forest, more valley, the cursed pocket reality rebuilding itself from the template carried within him. Look, Wallace said suddenly, pointing ahead. The mist had returned, coiling between trees in patterns too deliberate to be natural. It moved against the breeze, thickening and thinning in rhythmic pulses like the breathing of vast organism. It's starting, Ellie whispered. She turned to Daniel. How do you feel? Like I'm unraveling, he replied, searching for words to describe the sensation. Pieces of me flowing outward, but it's still inside me too. Watching waiting. The path ahead forked suddenly, one trail continuing straight, another veering sharply downward. Neither matched Daniel's memory of the route nor Ellie's crude map. "Which way?" Wallace asked, checking his compass. The needle spun uselessly, unable to find true north in this distorted space. Before either could answer, a figure appeared on the downward path, faint at first, then growing more distinct. A man in hiking gear, his back to them. "Matthew?" Daniel whispered, recognition immediate despite the impossibility. The figure turned partially, revealing a profile eerily similar to Daniel's own. He raised a hand in beckoning, then continued down the path, disappearing into the mist. "Is not your brother," Ellie said, grabbing Daniel's arm as he instinctively moved to follow. "It's the entity trying to separate you from us." "I know," Daniel replied, though the certainty in his voice belied the confusion in his heart. "But it might be leading us where we need to go anyway." Wallace shook his head. "It's a trap," Daniel conceded, "but we need to find the burial chamber, the original binding site, and I think the entity wants us to find it too." "Yes," the voice whispered inside him. "Return to the beginning. Complete the circle." "Why would it want?" Wallace demanded. "If's where we can rebind it?" Daniel struggled to articulate the knowledge flowing from the entity through him. "It doesn't want freedom. It wants resolution. This half-existence trapped between worlds neither here nor there. It's been torture, even for something like it." Ellie studied him closely. "You're sympathizing with it?" "No." Daniel shook his head firmly. "Understanding it. There's a difference." After a moment's hesitation, Ellie nodded. "The downward path, then. But we stay together. No matter what we see, no matter what happens, we don't separate." They descended, the path steeper than it appeared, the ground slick with moisture to cling to their boots. The mist thickened with each step, wrapping around them until their flashlight beams penetrated only a few feet ahead. Time distorted as they moved deeper. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, then compressed suddenly, the moon jumping positions in the sky visible through breaks in the canopy. Daniel's watch had stopped entirely, the hands frozen at the moment they'd entered the reconstituting valley. The entity's presence grew stronger, manifesting in increasingly tangible ways. Shadows moved independently of their casters. Whispers emanated from empty air. Occasionally, figures would appear at the edge of their vision, recognizable as former victims Daniel had glimpsed in the underground chamber, others unfamiliar but bearing the same haunted expressions. "Jesus," Wallace muttered as a woman in 19th century clothing walked parallel to their path, her form semi-transparent, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. "What are we seeing?" "Echoes," Ellie explained, voice tight with controlled fear. "The valley doesn't trap people physically. It preserves imprints of them, memories, emotions, experiences. Like psychic recordings?" Wallace sounded skeptical despite the evidence before his eyes. "More like fragments of souls," Daniel said, the knowledge coming unbidden from the entity within. "Pieces left behind when the valley consumed the rest." Wallace fell silent, his expression hardening into grim determination. His hand never strayed far from his weapon, eyes constantly scanning the mist for threats. But Daniel noticed the sheriff's gaze lingering on certain apparitions, searching for his father among the lost. The path ended abruptly at a sheer rock face, mist clinging to its surface in unnatural patterns. "Dead end," Wallace muttered, sweeping his flashlight across the stone. "No," Ellie said, moving closer to the rock face. "Look." Nearly invisible in the stone were carved symbols, the same intricate patterns Daniel had seen in the underground chamber. They pulsed faintly with an inner light to respond to their presence. "The outer markers," Ellie explained, consulting her grandmother's journal. "They indicate the boundary of the binding site." As she spoke, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The rock face before them shimmered like heat waves over asphalt, its solid surface becoming translucent, then transparent, revealing a tunnel beyond. "It's opening for us," Daniel said quietly. "Or it's a trap," Wallace countered, drawing his weapon. "Let me go first." He stepped toward the opening, but Daniel caught his arm. "Wait, something's wrong." The trembling intensified. The mist around them coalesced, forming humanoid shapes flickered between solidity and vapor. Voices rose from all directions, pleading, warning, threatening, a cacophony of the lost and consumed. "What's happening?" Wallace demanded, sweeping, his weapon in an arc, trying to target threats weren't fully there. "The valley is fully reconstituting," Ellie said, pressing close to Daniel, "and everything it's absorbed over the centuries is manifesting." Daniel felt it like a tide pulling away from him, the entity flowing outward, reclaiming its domain. Yet enough remained within him to maintain the connection, to whisper in his mind with growing confidence. "Almost home. Almost free. Further, brother." The tunnel beyond the rock face darkened suddenly, a presence moving within it. Something large, something wrong. Daniel took an instinctive step back, pulling Ellie with him. "We need to go around," he said urgently. "Find another way in." "There is no other way," Ellie insisted. "The burial chamber has only one entrance." Before they could argue further, the presence in the tunnel surged forward. A roiling darkness exploded outward, engulfing them in freezing cold and the stench of ancient decay. Daniel felt it pass through him like a physical blow, momentarily severing his connection to the entity within. When the darkness receded, Wallace was gone. "Tom," Ellie shouted, spinning around, searching the mist. "Tom, where are you?" Nothing but silence answered. Then, distantly, they heard his voice. A shout of surprise or fear cut short. His radio crackled on Ellie's belt, emitting a burst of static followed by what might have been his voice, distorted, beyond recognition. "Daniel, it's not—" The transmission dissolved into white noise, then silence. "We have to find him," Ellie said, already moving in the direction of the shout. Daniel caught her arm. "We can't. The valley took him. If we go searching, it will separate us too." "We can't leave him." Ellie's composed facade cracked, real fear showing through. "We're not," Daniel said firmly. "The best way to help him is to reach the burial chamber. Complete the binding. Bring the valley back under control." Ellie stared at him, conflict evident in her expression. Finally, she nodded, though the decision clearly pained her. "You're right. But if we find him on the way, we help him," Daniel agreed. They turned back to the tunnel entrance. The darkness had receded, leaving the passage open and seemingly empty. Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself against the sensation of the entity continuing to flow outward. "It's weakening inside me," he told Ellie, returning to the valley. "But I think enough will remain to complete the ritual." "Let's hope so," Ellie replied grimly, "because we only get one shot at this." They entered the tunnel, flashlights illuminating walls covered in the now familiar symbols. Unlike before, these were vibrant, glowing with inner light pulsed in rhythm with Daniel's heartbeat. The passage descended steeply, twisting in ways defied natural geology. As they ventured deeper, the distortions in reality grew more pronounced. The tunnel occasionally to invert, the floor becoming ceiling, gravity shifting momentarily before reasserting itself. Sections of wall became transparent, revealing glimpses into other times, other experiences, the valley's history playing out in fragmented scenes. They saw native tribes performing rituals around a central altar, colonial-era settlers fleeing in terror from unseen threats. More recent visitors, including what might have been Sheriff Wallace's father, following a woman who could only be Ellie's grandmother. "They were looking for the binding site," Ellie whispered, watching the ghostly figures move through a landscape overlapped with the tunnel. They knew it was weakening even then. The visions shifted, showing the underground chamber Daniel had discovered, but intact, pristine, not the ancient ruin he had found. 7 elders stood around the central altar, their blood flowing freely from self-inflicted wounds, coalescing into chains wrapped around a shapeless darkness hovering above the stone. "The original binding," Daniel murmured. 7 sacrifices, to create 7 chains. The vision faded as the tunnel finally opened into a vast natural cavern. At its center stood a familiar sight, the burial chamber, its entrance flanked by megalithic stones carved with protective symbols. But unlike in Daniel's memory, these symbols were faded, many crumbling, their power visibly diminished. "The seal is broken," Ellie said unnecessarily. "Like your notes described." They approached cautiously. The air around the chamber entrance rippled with unnatural energy, distorting light, sound, even thought itself. Daniel felt the entity within him straining toward it, eager to return to its original container. "Something's wrong," he said, halting several yards from the entrance. "It's too eager. This feels like a trap," Ellie finished for him. "But what choice do we have? This is the binding site. If we're going to perform the ritual, it has to be here." Before Daniel could respond, a figure stepped from the chamber entrance. Wallace, his expression blank, his movements mechanical. Behind him came another figure and another, people Daniel recognized from visions and memories. Holloway, Sheriff Wallace's father, Ellie's grandmother. Drawn to the blank spaces on maps as Daniel had been, she would be waiting. She would warn them as she had been warned. And hope this time they would listen. For some secrets must remain buried. Some boundaries must be maintained. Some valleys must keep their silence no matter the cost. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.